The Dark Scrolls. Under the dim light of a flickering candle, an archivist might unroll a parchment long buried beneath layers of royal dust. A parchment inked not with decrees or treaties, but with the ache of women whose bodies bore the weight of an empire. It begins, as all Tudor tales do, in blood and in fear. England, early in the 16th century, a kingdom newly wrested from chaos. The Wars of the Roses had ended, but only in name. The ghosts of York and Lancaster still walked the corridors of power, whispering through the chill stone of Westminster and the vaulted ceilings of the Tower. The Tudor dynasty, a thread barely stitched into the torn fabric of monarchy, stood fragile, like a candle trembling in the draught of history. Its survival depended on the simplest and cruelest of hopes: a son. In those years, the question of succession was not political theory. It was the pulse of the realm. The kingdom's peace, the church's stability, the fates of nobles and peasants alike, all tethered to the ability of one man, Henry Tudor, and the women he would wed. To the chroniclers of that age, the body of the queen was not her own. It was the territory upon which dynasties rose or fell. When the court physicians placed their hands upon a royal belly, they were not merely feeling for life. They were taking the pulse of England itself. No parchment of that time speaks openly of the terror that accompanied conception, but it is there, between the lines of letters and chronicles, in the silences of the court. A queen's worth was measured in months of swelling expectation. Her failure could alter the map of nations. To bear a prince or perish, that was the unspoken law carved into the marrow of Tudor queenship. The royal womb was both altar and battlefield, the sanctified space upon which salvation or damnation of the dynasty would be inscribed. When Henry VIII ascended the throne in 1509, the kingdom exhaled. The young monarch was handsome, learned, filled with vigor, the embodiment of renewal after years of unrest. His marriage to Catherine of Aragon, daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, symbolized not merely alliance, but divine order restored. Yet beneath the music of their coronation, beneath the golden tapestries of Westminster Abbey, lay the tremor of prophecy, the fear that heaven might withhold its heir. England had seen what happened when thrones lacked sons. Civil war, pretenders, and foreign invasions had turned the island into a graveyard of ambitions. The Tudors were new, too new, and legitimacy was a fragile thing. Even Henry's claim to the throne rested upon the uncertain right of conquest and papal sanction. To secure his line, he needed a boy, one whose cry could silence every whisper of doubt. The court's obsession with fertility became ritual. When Catherine's belly began to swell, the bells of London rang in celebration. When she miscarried, those same bells tolled in mourning. The royal physicians recorded the events with clinical precision, as if noting the rise and fall of empires in their ledgers. 6 pregnancies, each ending in sorrow, but one, the birth of a daughter, Mary. For a brief moment, the court rejoiced, for Mary lived, and hope, though diminished, remained. But for Henry, whose eyes had been trained since childhood to see sons as the seal of divine favor, a daughter was both blessing and rebuke. As years passed and Catherine aged, the court began to look upon her not as the Queen of England, but as the vessel that had failed. Gossip spread through the corridors, hushed, poisonous rumors suggesting that God had cursed the union. Some said it was because Catherine had once been the wife of Henry's brother, Arthur, whose death still shadowed the royal conscience. Others whispered that the blood of Spain had brought misfortune, as though destiny itself recoiled from foreign wombs. In chapel, Catherine prayed for the souls of her lost children, infants who had lived only long enough to be baptized and buried. Chroniclers describe her kneeling before altars draped in black, her lips moving in silent petition as wax dripped like tears down the tall candles. Yet even as she prayed, the machinery of her undoing turned behind her. Henry's eyes wandered to a lady of the court, a dark-eyed woman with wit sharper than any courtier's blade. Her name was Anne Boleyn, and she carried in her laughter the promise of renewal. In that moment, the story of royal childbirth became the story of sin, sanctity, and power. Catherine's tragedy, the repeated stillness of the cradle, would become the justification for the greatest schism in English religious history. The failure of her womb would be transformed into the failure of Rome, and in that alchemy of loss and ambition, the English Reformation was conceived. But before that storm would break, the court lived in strange duality, outward piety and inward panic. The Queen aged in the shadows of her private chapel, surrounded by tapestries of saints and angels who seemed to turn their eyes away. Henry, restless and guilt-torn, read the book of Leviticus, interpreting its words as a divine curse upon his marriage, that a man who takes his brother's wife will be childless. It mattered little that Mary lived. To Henry, a daughter was not an heir, and the verse became prophecy. The scholars of his court, sensing the wind's shift, began to argue theology in whispers. Was the king truly cursed, or merely impatient? Could God's will be so clearly read in the sorrow of a woman's womb? The chroniclers disagree, but what is certain is this. By the late 1520s, Catherine's fate was sealed. The annulment, not called divorce, for that word was too crude for royal ears, became an affair of state and soul. When Henry sought to free himself, he sought also to unbind England from the Pope. It was no longer the Queen who stood trial, but the very fabric of Christendom. And yet, in all that thunder of sermons and edicts, one image remained constant. Catherine of Aragon, her hands clasped, her face pale beneath a widow's veil, whispering prayers for children who never drew breath. Her tragedy was not merely maternal. It was political, spiritual, and human all at once. Her body had been the ground upon which faith and power collided. When she died, years later, in a cold castle far from court, Henry did not come. A black cloth was hung over her coffin, bearing the words, "The most beloved and rightful Queen." Whether the king wept in secret or felt only the relief of freedom, no chronicle dares to say. But history remembers her as the first offering, the woman who bore the price of dynasty and set the pattern for those who would follow. In her wake came Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, Catherine Parr, names that form a litany of blood and hope. Each would enter the palace with the same promise, to give England a prince. Each would find that promise twisted by fate. But in the beginning, before the executions and the schisms, before the silent cradles and ghostly heirs, There was only one unyielding truth whispered through every chapel and corridor. England must not fall back into the dark. A son must be born, no matter the cost. Thus begins the ledger of Tudor motherhood, written not in ink, but in the tears and blood of queens. It is the story of a kingdom that measured holiness by fertility, and of women whose lives became prayers that went unanswered. Their cries, once muffled by stone walls, still echo faintly across the centuries, as if carried by the rustling of old parchment in some forgotten archive, waiting to be read again beneath the dim, trembling light. The story moves now from the trembling dawn of a dynasty to the quiet chamber where faith and blood met in silence. Catherine of Aragon had entered England not as a stranger, but as a promise, a bridge of peace between Spain and the island kingdom, still trembling from war. She had been betrothed first to Prince Arthur, Henry's elder brother, and when he died scarcely 5 months after their wedding, she was left a widow in a foreign land, a relic of a political plan now undone by mortality. For years she lingered at court in uncertainty, her dowry disputed, her fate unresolved. Chroniclers wrote of her steadfast piety, her daily prayers, her gentle grace, and the rumor, persistent, poisonous, that her brief marriage to Arthur had never been consummated. That rumor would become the cornerstone of Henry's future conscience, or his excuse. When Henry ascended the throne in 1509, he was 17, radiant, golden, adored. And Catherine, 6 years his elder, was the embodiment of dignity. Their union was hailed as divine symmetry. England and Spain united beneath the cross, a new Camelot. The people rejoiced, the court glittered, and for a brief time it seemed heaven had blessed the Tudors. But the true measure of royal favor was not in coronations or treaties. It was in the cradle. The first pregnancy came swiftly. Bells rang across London, the fountains of Cheapside flowed with wine. Prayers rose from abbeys and inns alike for the birth of a prince. On the first day of January 1511, Catherine delivered a boy, Henry, Duke of Cornwall, and for a moment the realm trembled with joy. Bonfires blazed from Dover to York. Poets wrote verses, comparing the infant to Solomon and Alexander. Yet 52 days later, the child was dead. The bells that had proclaimed his birth tolled again for his funeral. Chroniclers describe the king withdrawing into silence, his face shadowed. Catherine bore her grief in prayer, fasting until her maids feared she might waste away from sorrow. But she conceived again, this time a stillbirth, then another, a son who lived only moments, then a daughter, gone within days. Each pregnancy renewed the cycle of public hope and private despair. By 1516, Catherine's body carried the memory of 6 children, but only one had lived, Mary, the future queen. To the court, Mary's birth was both miracle and mockery. The child survived, healthy and strong, yet her gender was a disappointment wrapped in ceremony. Courtiers bowed, musicians played, but the king's smile did not reach his eyes. "A daughter," he said, "is not what we prayed for, but she may yet serve God's will." The rhythm of the court changed after that. Catherine, once radiant and beloved, began to fade beneath layers of ritual and duty. Her gowns grew darker, her laughter rarer. She prayed longer hours, kneeling on cold stone until her strength trembled beneath the weight of devotion. To some, her faith seemed unshakable. To others, it was the quiet desperation of a woman bargaining with heaven. In the archives of her household, fragments of her letters survive, formal, measured, yet pulsing with private pain. She speaks of resignation to divine will, of the mysterious purposes of God, of patience. But one phrase appears more than once. "If it be his will that I bear no more sons, I pray that I might bear the strength to endure his choice." Outside those walls, the kingdom's patience waned. Henry was no longer the radiant youth who had first married her. The years of tournaments and revels had given way to calculation. His line, his very claim to the throne, still rested on a single child, and a female at that. Every illness Mary suffered, every fevered night, turned the court into a chamber of dread. Whispers grew louder. What if she died? What if the Tudors, like the Plantagenets before them, left no heir but ruin? It was then, in the late 1520s, that Henry began to read scripture with the hunger of a desperate man. Leviticus 20:21. "If a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing. They shall be childless." The verse struck him like a revelation, or so he later claimed. In it, he saw divine condemnation, a curse that explained his losses, his frustrations, his restless heart. But others saw only self-justification, the mind of a man who had grown weary of failure and sought holiness in his desire for another woman. That woman was Anne Boleyn. Anne had been maid of honor to Queen Catherine, a slender figure with dark eyes and a French education. Unlike the docile ladies of court, she carried herself with an audacious wit that enchanted and unsettled men in equal measure. She refused the king's advances at first, perhaps understanding that in England a mistress could be adored, but only a wife could endure. Henry pursued her for years, promising marriage, reform, even the rewriting of divine law if need be. Catherine, watching this from the shadows of her chapel, refused to yield. She saw herself as a lawful wife and queen, bound by sacrament before God. To her, Henry's quest for annulment was not only betrayal but heresy. When summoned before tribunals to declare her marriage invalid, she knelt, placed her hand upon her heart, and declared before judges and ambassadors that she had come to England a virgin, that her marriage to Henry had been pure and lawful, and that she would die his true wife. Her words, recorded by chroniclers, silenced even her enemies. "I have been to you a true and humble wife," she said, "ever conformable to your will and pleasure." But Henry's will had already turned. The Pope hesitated to grant the annulment, fearing Spain's wrath. Henry's patience broke. By 1533, he severed England from Rome entirely, declaring himself head of the Church. The Queen was cast aside, her titles stripped, her servants dismissed. Anne was crowned in her stead. In this act, born from the ashes of Catherine's failed pregnancies, England transformed itself. The dissolution of papal authority, the rise of Protestant reform, the confiscation of monasteries, all were the fruits of one man's hunger for a son. The Reformation, for all its theological thunder, began in the silence of a woman's womb. Catherine lived her remaining years in exile at Kimbolton Castle, a prisoner in all but name. Her health declined rapidly. Those who saw her near the end described her as pale and wasted, yet serene, her rosary always in hand. She wrote letters to her daughter, to her nephew, the emperor, and even to Henry himself, forgiving him, blessing him, calling him my most dear lord and husband. When she died in January 1536, at the age of 50, her body was found with her hand clutching a crucifix so tightly that it had to be pried from her fingers. At her funeral, she was buried not as a queen, but as the Dowager Princess of Wales, the title of a widow from a marriage the king now claimed had never been valid. Yet the people did not forget. To them she remained the rightful queen, the woman who had endured humiliation with the grace of a martyr. Those who served her spoke of strange signs that followed her death. A heart found blackened within her chest, said to be proof of poison or divine mystery. A white dove seen circling her coffin before it was sealed. Superstition or symbol, the chronicles preserve both, as though history itself hesitated between faith and suspicion. Henry received the news of her death with a curious detachment. Some say he wore yellow to court the next day, a color of celebration, and held feasts in the company of Anne Boleyn, now his wife, and already heavy with child. Whether this was joy or denial, no one could say. But those who had served Catherine understood. The Queen was gone, and with her, the last trace of the old order. In the dim chambers of Kimbolton, her legacy lingered, not in monuments or victories, but in the quiet endurance of faith. Catherine's life had been the crucible in which the Tudor experiment was forged. Loyalty against desire, faith against ambition, conscience against crown. Her suffering, multiplied in whispers and sermons, became the template by which the English judged their monarchs. And yet, the curse she was said to bear did not die with her. Within months of her passing, Anne Boleyn miscarried the son she had promised Henry, and the king's heart turned again. History, it seemed, demanded another sacrifice. But before Anne's own tragedy unfolds, one must pause upon the image of Catherine's empty cradle, that small wooden monument to all that was lost. In its silence lies the sound of England's transformation, the death of an heir, the birth of a church, and the echo of a woman's prayer unanswered. In time, her daughter Mary would rise to the throne, inheriting both her mother's faith and her father's fire. But the seed of sorrow had already been sown. For every queen who followed, the lesson of Catherine of Aragon would linger like a ghost. The body of a woman could alter the fate of empires, and in its failure, kingdoms could be remade. So the archivists who study her life write not of failure, but of inevitability, a pattern set in motion by bloodlines and belief. She had given England not the son it demanded, but the conscience it would one day need. Her prayers, unanswered in life, became prophecy in death. In the candle-lit hush of those long Tudor nights, one imagines the king awake, haunted not by guilt, but by memory. The echo of Catherine's voice in Latin prayer, the touch of her hand at Mass, the scent of incense rising toward a heaven that had turned its face away. For all his triumphs, Henry would never escape the ghost of the woman who bore his failures with the serenity of a saint. And as the chroniclers closed that chapter of the royal ledger, they left an unspoken warning for those who would follow. The throne may demand heirs, but heaven exacts its own price. The winter after Catherine's death was unseasonably bright. The sun rose over Whitehall Palace as if to bless a new age, and yet Beneath that golden light, the scent of incense from her funeral had not entirely faded. Henry VIII walked the galleries now with Anne Boleyn at his side, the woman for whom he had defied Pope and Christendom alike. In her dark eyes burned the fierce intelligence that had once captivated him, but also the shadow of a destiny she could not escape. For if Catherine's tragedy had been to fail despite her virtue, Anne's would be to triumph, only to fall from the height of it. To understand Anne, one must imagine the court as it was in those first years of her ascendancy, a theatre of brilliance and unease. The courtiers bowed lower now, but with eyes that measured rather than adored. The realm was divided, one half praising the Queen who had delivered England from Rome, the other cursing the harlot who had bewitched their king. And through it all, Anne stood unmoved, dressed in silks of crimson and black, a golden bee pendant at her throat, as if daring heaven itself to judge her. When she married Henry in secret in January 1533, she was already pregnant. The ceremony was conducted in haste, before dawn, without the pomp that had crowned Catherine. It was, in every sense, an act of defiance, the union of a king who had made himself head of his own church, and a queen whose body now carried the legitimacy of that rebellion. If she bore a son, history would absolve them both. That summer, as her belly grew, the nation trembled with expectation. The English Reformation, still new and unstable, rested upon the unborn child of a woman many considered a heretic. Preachers spoke from pulpits that God's favor would be proven by the birth of a prince. Astrologers calculated the stars and assured their patrons the heavens foretold a boy. The air in London thickened with both hope and resentment. On a September afternoon, Anne went into labor. The court held its breath, and when the cries from her chamber broke the stillness, they carried both victory and doom. For the child was a girl. The infant was christened Elizabeth. Accounts of that day differ. Some chroniclers wrote that Henry received the news with magnanimity, saying that if this daughter were a gift from God, sons would surely follow. Others noted that he concealed his disappointment poorly, pacing the corridors in silence, while his courtiers exchanged uncertain glances. But in the weeks that followed, his demeanor softened. Elizabeth was healthy, strong, and quick to smile, the very image of her mother's vitality. He kissed her forehead in public and called her "my pearl." For a moment, the kingdom dared to believe that this daughter might yet be enough. Anne herself was radiant. She surrounded her child with scholars and nurses, determined that Elizabeth should be both brilliant and beloved. She wrote to her relatives that the infant's birth was only the beginning, that, "In God's grace, I shall yet bring forth princes to this realm." But time once again was cruel. Her next pregnancy ended in miscarriage. So did the one after. The court, ever watchful, began to murmur. Some said the queen had grown too proud. Others whispered that she had offended God by replacing a pious wife. Still others, more venomous, claimed witchcraft, that her miscarriages were punishment for charms once used to ensnare the king. In the flickering candlelight of private chambers, ladies exchanged glances heavy with fear. Anne's enemies multiplied with each empty cradle. Thomas Cromwell, the king's chief minister, had once been her ally, the architect of her rise. But as the political tides shifted, their interests diverged.
She demanded greater charity for the poor and the reform of monasteries. Cromwell preferred their dissolution and the seizure of their wealth.
Their conflict became one of survival. By the start of 1536, Anne was again with child. Henry, growing older and more burdened by doubt, prayed fervently for a son. He spoke of omens and dreams, of signs that this would be the one. Yet fate, always cruel to the Tudors, intervened. In January, the king was thrown from his horse during a tournament at Greenwich. He lay unconscious for hours, his life feared lost. When news reached Anne, 5 months pregnant, she collapsed. Days later, she miscarried. The child, by all accounts, was a boy. That loss marked the turning point. In the chronicles of the time, one senses a shift in tone, from reverence to fatalism. Henry's affection, already strained, curdled into resentment. He avoided Anne's chambers, dining apart, speaking curtly. Within weeks, his gaze had settled upon one of her ladies-in-waiting, Jane Seymour, pale, docile, the opposite of the fiery queen who now found herself isolated. Cromwell saw opportunity. He had long known that the king's patience was finite and that his conscience could be molded by fear. So he whispered of treason. He collected fragments, glances, words, laughter, and wove them into accusation. Court musicians were questioned, courtiers arrested. The queen herself was charged with adultery, incest, and conspiring against the king's life. No evidence of substance existed, but in Tudor England, guilt required only necessity. On May 2nd, 1536, Anne Boleyn was arrested and taken to the Tower of London, the same fortress that had once echoed with her laughter as she watched tournaments below its walls. Now it was her prison. Witnesses describe her arrival, calm, even smiling, as if disbelief were her only refuge. "Is this how the king rewards me?" she asked her guards. "Well, I suppose I must learn to suffer." In her cell she prayed, wrote letters, and pleaded for her brother and the others arrested with her. She confessed nothing, denied everything, but her fate had already been written, not by evidence, but by the silence of a king who no longer loved her. The trial was held in the great hall of the Tower, before peers whose verdict was foregone. Anne stood before them in a gown of deep black satin. Her head held high, she spoke with clarity, proclaiming her innocence and forgiving her accusers. "I have always been a faithful wife," she said, "though in my heart I have offended many by my presumption." Even her enemies were moved. But when the jury returned, it was unanimous, guilty. Henry, eager to remarry, ordered that the execution be carried out swiftly. He granted her the mercy of a French swordsman rather than the axe. The morning of May 19th dawned cold and still. Anne walked to the scaffold dressed in gray damask, her hands folded, her eyes lifted toward the sky. A crowd gathered, courtiers, soldiers, commoners, the theater of justice that had become England's new ritual. She knelt, spoke her final words, that she prayed for the king, that she died his faithful wife, that she sought forgiveness from all. Then, with one swift stroke, it was done. Her body was buried in an unmarked grave within the Tower grounds. No stone bore her name, no hymn her memory. Only silence. Yet her presence lingered. In the months that followed, rumors spread of strange occurrences, of a spectral figure walking the corridors at night, of a woman's voice singing lullabies from the chapel where Elizabeth had once been christened. The superstitious saw in these tales a sign of injustice unatoned. Historians, more cautious, see instead the persistence of collective guilt. For Henry, the death of Anne was both liberation and curse. Within days he was betrothed to Jane Seymour. Within weeks, Anne's portraits were removed, her initials erased from palace walls. Yet the daughter she bore, the one child he had not desired, would one day eclipse them all. In retrospect, the tragedy of Anne Boleyn is not merely her fall, but the machinery that made it possible. She had been the catalyst of a nation's transformation, the reason England broke from Rome, the symbol of its new sovereignty. But when her body failed to produce the heir that justified her rebellion, she became expendable. The same passion that had elevated her now demanded her blood. Contemporaries struggled to explain her end. Some saw divine retribution for her ambition, others the cruelty of a man who mistook desire for destiny. The truth lies, perhaps, somewhere in between. Anne was both victim and architect of her fate. She had played the game of kings and believed intelligence and charm could secure her against the world's oldest power, the need for a male heir. Her daughter Elizabeth would inherit that paradox. The lesson that survival in the Tudor world required mastery of both obedience and defiance. But that story belongs to another time, when the sins of mothers became the burdens of daughters. For now the candle burns low in the Tower Chapel, where the air still carries the faint scent of lilies and fear. Anne Boleyn's name, struck from record and restored only centuries later, endures not because she failed, but because she embodied the eternal conflict between love and power. The court moved on, as courts always do. New tapestries hung where hers had been. New music filled the halls. Yet for those who had witnessed her rise and fall, something of the old world had died with her. The glamour of monarchy had given way to its raw machinery. Marriage as politics, faith as instrument, life as spectacle. And somewhere, in the private chambers of Whitehall, the king sat alone, his conscience cloaked in silence. The two women who had defined his life, one saintly, one scandalous, were both gone. In their place, an emptiness neither crown nor sun could fill. The chronicles closed that year with a curious note, that the weather was uncommonly still, that birds fell silent near the tower, that the Thames ran dark for days. Whether nature mourned or merely carried on is impossible to say. But history remembers that moment as the hinge of Henry's reign, the point where passion turned to tyranny, and the hope for sons became a curse upon every woman who dared to love a king. The summer that followed Anne Boleyn's execution was strangely quiet. No great mourning hung over London, no public rage. Only the faint unease that comes when too much blood has been spilled too quickly. The tower's stones had barely dried when the bells tolled again, this time not for death, but for betrothal. Within 11 days of Anne's beheading, Henry VIII was engaged to Jane Seymour, a woman whose stillness promised to soothe a heart long bruised by passion. Jane was no court intriguer, no fiery reformist. She came from an old but modest family, raised in the green quiet of Wiltshire, educated not in the art of wit, but in the virtues of silence and obedience. She had served both Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn, watching in silence as each fell beneath the weight of the king's desire. To those who later called her cunning, her defenders replied, no, only patient. A woman who understood that in Henry's world, survival required invisibility. When she first caught the king's attention, her demeanor was the perfect antidote to Anne's defiance. Where Anne had argued, Jane listened. Where Anne had mocked, Jane knelt. Courtiers noted how Henry softened around her, his temper subdued, his voice gentler. To them she seemed the balm for his restless spirit, the quiet that follows a storm. But in truth, Jane understood the peril as well as any woman alive. She had seen how quickly love could become accusation, how the marriage bed could transform into a scaffold. Their wedding took place at the Palace of Whitehall on May 30th, 1536, barely 2 weeks after Anne's death. No lavish coronation followed. No pageants or tournaments announced her queenship. Henry was weary of spectacle. Instead, the new queen's virtue was praised in sermons as the restorer of peace. She was to heal the realm and the king alike by fulfilling the oldest and simplest duty of a royal wife, to bear a son. From the beginning, Jane's position at court was precarious. She had the king's favor, yes, but none of Anne's influence. Henry, cautious now, kept the reins of government in his own hands, and Jane, perhaps wisely, sought no share in them. Her household was modest, her presence discreet. But beneath that calm exterior, her task was clear. England waited, breath held, for her womb to deliver what 2 queens had failed to give, a living, legitimate prince. In those first months, she walked the narrow corridors of power with careful steps. She restored Mary, Catherine of Aragon's daughter, to the king's good graces, a gesture both compassionate and shrewd. The people, who had loved Catherine and loathed Anne, now hailed Jane as a kind of reconciliation between past and present. Ballads were sung of her gentleness. Poets called her the dove amidst hawks. But even the purest dove in Tudor England carried the burden of prophecy. To fail in childbirth was to fall from grace. By the spring of 1537, the Queen's swelling belly was the subject of every prayer and wager. Henry, now 46, moved through the palaces with renewed vigor, smiling at the courtiers who offered congratulations. He had begun building a new nursery wing at Hampton Court even before the birth. A gesture of faith or arrogance, none could tell. Physicians were summoned from across the realm, midwives trained, relics of saints placed beneath the royal bed for protection. October came, cold and bright. On the night of the 11th, the Queen went into labor. It would last nearly 3 days. The corridors of Hampton Court filled with whispers and footsteps. Courtiers paced, messengers waited with trembling hands. From within the Queen's chamber came muffled cries, prayers, commands, the rhythm of pain that echoed like the tolling of distant bells. Henry himself, unable to bear the suspense, knelt in his private chapel, invoking God's mercy. At last, on the morning of October 12th, 1537, the cry of a newborn pierced the air. A boy, a living, breathing boy. Edward, Prince of Wales. The rejoicing was immediate and immense. Bells rang across the kingdom, cannons roared from the tower, churches overflowed with thanksgiving. Henry wept openly, embracing his courtiers. "God has heard my prayers," he declared, "and all shall be well." For the first time in nearly 30 years, the Tudor line seemed secure. Jane, pale and exhausted, smiled weakly when they placed the child in her arms. Witnesses described the scene. The king kneeling beside her bed, tears streaking his face, whispering words no scribe dared record. For a few brief days, England believed itself redeemed. The queen who had given them a prince was hailed as a saint in her own lifetime. But joy in Tudor England was always shadowed by mortality. Within hours, Jane began to sicken. The physicians spoke in vague tones, the flux, the fever, an ill humor of the womb. In truth, it was puerperal infection, the silent assassin of childbirth. She grew weaker with each passing day, her body burning with fever as the bells of celebration still echoed in the streets. Henry refused to leave her side. He had ordered new tapestries for her chambers, plans for her coronation as Mother of the Air. Yet by the third day after the birth, hope began to fade. Chroniclers describe her speaking softly to her ladies, asking them to care for the prince, to ensure he was raised in virtue. She spoke little of herself, only of duty. On the night of October 24th, as the candles guttered and the rain beat against the windows, Queen Jane Seymour died. She was 29 years old. The nation that had feasted for her triumph now wept. Bells that had tolled in celebration now tolled for mourning. The king locked himself away for days, refusing food or company. When he emerged, his face was ashen, his eyes hollow. To those who dared approach him, he said only, "She was the only one who truly loved me." It was a statement less about truth than about yearning. Henry had loved many women, but Jane had given him what no other could, the son who would carry his name. In death, she became the embodiment of the ideal wife, chaste, dutiful, and silent. The court, eager to sanctify her memory, commissioned portraits showing her serene and unearthly, her complexion pale as marble, her expression calm. She became the virgin queen of Henry's imagination, the Madonna who had died to give England its savior. Her funeral was the grandest of any Tudor queen. Draped in white and gold, her coffin was carried to St. George's Chapel at Windsor. Monks sang requiems as the cortege wound through the misty autumn fields. The king did not attend, citing grief too great to bear, but he ordered that he be buried beside her when his own time came. In the chronicles of the court, Jane's death marks a strange interlude, a pause between storms. Henry, now both widower and father of a long-awaited heir, seemed for a time almost human again. He visited his son daily, called him "my precious jewel," and commissioned medals engraved with the boy's image. But even in this quiet, the machinery of monarchy never slept. The infant Edward became the center of every ambition, every plot. Jane's ghost, serene and untouchable, hovered over them all. The people, remembering her gentleness, prayed for her soul as if she were already canonized. Ballads mourned her as the rose that withered in her bloom. Yet among the king's counselors, her death was a warning that even in victory, the Tudor womb was a perilous throne. As the years passed, Henry married again. First Anne of Cleves, whom he divorced within months. Then Catherine Howard, whose youth and recklessness led her to the same scaffold as Anne Boleyn. Each union began with the same desperate hope and ended in disillusion. Only one constant remained, the tomb of Jane Seymour, the silent witness to every new betrayal. Henry aged into legend, his body swollen, his temper monstrous. But even as his kingdom grew richer, his heart seemed to decay. Those who attended him in his final years claimed he spoke often of Jane, that he kept her portrait near his bedside, that he referred to her as my true queen. Whether this was love or guilt, history cannot say. What is certain is that when he died in 1547, his body was laid beside hers, just as he had ordered. Their tomb bears no effigy, no gilded monument, only the simple inscription of their names. Yet her story did not end there. The son for whom she died, Edward VI, would rule but briefly. Crowned at 9, dead at 15, his reign was a fragile echo of the dream that had cost so many lives. Under his name, England became truly Protestant, severing the last threads that bound it to Rome. His death reignited the very succession crisis his birth was meant to end. Thus Jane's triumph proved fleeting, her sacrifice in vain. But the memory of her devotion endured, reshaped by centuries into legend. To later generations, she was the sainted mother, the woman who redeemed the king's sins with her purity. To the historians who sift through the dust of archives, she was something more complex, the final fatal proof that in the Tudor court, love was only another word for obligation, and childbirth another form of execution. If one listens closely, one might still hear her in the quiet of St. George's Chapel. The rustle of silk, the faint sigh of a woman who won everything, only to lose her life in the winning. The candle burns low beside her tomb, its flame trembling against the cold stone, and the air smells faintly of wax and roses, as if time itself remembers the queen who bled for a kingdom's future. Her story closes not in grandeur, but in silence, the silence she carried through her life, and the silence in which England finally found its heir. The child who cost his mother's life grew to become the frail center of England's destiny. Edward VI, Jane Seymour's son, inherited a crown woven from sorrow. His father's dying wish had been that the boy secure the Tudor line forever. Yet Edward's small, pale hands trembled when he lifted the scepter. Behind the trumpets of coronation echoed the ghosts of all who had bled for him: Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour. And in the silent aisles of St. George's Chapel, the dust of queens stirred as though restless. Edward's reign, though earnest, was brief and cold as winter sunlight. The child king lived under the regency of men who saw in him their own reflection of power. Under his name, England was remade again, the altars stripped bare, the Latin masses silenced, the cross of Rome replaced by the austere faith of Geneva. Yet in the boy's hollow eyes, courtiers saw the fragility of divine favor. He coughed blood, faded, and died at 15. His death was the final unraveling of the promise Jane Seymour had bought with her life. And so the kingdom turned again to its women, to the daughters of Henry's other wives, long shadows in waiting: Mary, the child of Catherine of Aragon, and Elizabeth, the child of Anne Boleyn. Both carried the scars of their mother's fates. Both had been declared illegitimate in childhood, reinstated only by convenience, raised under suspicion, and taught that trust was a language for fools. When Edward died, each saw the crown not as an inheritance, but as a test. Mary was 37 when the crown finally came to her. The streets of London rang with celebration, bells, bonfires, the smoke of relief after years of male regency. The people adored her then, the daughter of the wronged queen who had suffered exile and humiliation. In her they saw justice restored. She rode into the city on a white horse, the crucifix high above her head, her face pale but serene, her eyes wet with triumph. The daughter of Catherine had come home. Yet peace in Tudor England was always an illusion. Beneath the cheering crowds lay an undercurrent of fear. Mary was unmarried, and without a husband she could bear no heir. The very question that had destroyed her mother now returned to haunt her. Within months of her coronation, ambassadors swarmed the court, offering suitors from every corner of Europe. She chose Philip of Spain, the son of the same emperor who had once been her protector. To many Englishmen, this was betrayal, the daughter of England's proudest queen surrendering herself to a foreign prince. But to Mary, it was salvation. She had loved him from afar, and more than that, she saw in him the promise of a Catholic heir who would redeem her mother's name and restore England's soul. The marriage, held in 1554, was grand, but joyless. The English nobility stood in uneasy silence, their loyalty split between fear of Spain and devotion to their queen. Philip was courteous but distant, a soldier of empire who viewed his wife as duty, not desire. Yet Mary's heart burned with fervent faith, and soon with the fever of hope. By the winter of that year, rumors swept the realm that the queen was with child. Physicians confirmed it. Her belly swelled. Her appetite changed. The court prepared the nurseries and stitched garments for a royal infant. Prayers of thanksgiving were said across England. The old dream, a Tudor heir born of lawful marriage and Catholic grace, seemed finally within reach. The months dragged on. Her stomach grew round. Her movements slowed. Foreign ambassadors wrote home that the queen glowed with expectation. But her spring turned to summer. Doubt crept in. The days passed the due date, and still there was no child. The midwives waited. The court held its breath. And then the truth spread like smoke. There was no baby. The queen's belly, distended and painful, was not the sign of life, but of illness. It was the cruelest echo of her mother's suffering, the body betraying the spirit, the hope of redemption dissolving into humiliation. Courtiers began to avoid her gaze. Philip departed for the continent, citing affairs of state, leaving behind a wife whose body had become the symbol of divine mockery. Mary did not yield. She believed the delay was God's testing. But no child came. Instead came whispers that she was cursed, that her womb was barren, that she had mistaken a tumor for a pregnancy. Her enemies, emboldened, began to plot again. As the years waned, so too did Mary's health. Her skin yellowed, her eyes dimmed, and her spirit, once radiant with faith, grew brittle. Yet even then she prayed for a son, promising God her own life in exchange. It was not granted. In November 1558, she died in her bed at St. James's Palace. Her last words said to be of her mother's name and the word Calais, the final fragment of English soil lost to France under her reign. When her body was carried to Westminster, few wept. The people who had once hailed her as deliverer now remembered her as Bloody Mary, the queen whose zeal for Catholic restoration had burned hundreds at the stake. But beneath the smoke of her legend, there remains the same grief that haunted every Tudor woman, the unfulfilled prayer for a child. In the next procession, not long after, Another woman rode through the streets, her hair loose, her gown of gold catching the light. Elizabeth, daughter of the executed Anne Boleyn, now Queen of England. The contrast was almost too perfect, as if written by divine irony. Mary had sought redemption through marriage and motherhood. Elizabeth would seek salvation through solitude and rule. The court that had once doubted her birth now hailed her as a miracle. She spoke to her people not as a mother or wife, but as a sovereign in her own right. "I have already joined myself in marriage to a husband," she told them. The Kingdom of England. From the moment she ascended the throne, the pressure to marry began anew. Ambassadors from France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire offered her suitors, princes, dukes, heirs. But Elizabeth learned from her mother's ghost that marriage to a king meant servitude, and from her sister's shadow that childbirth could become a grave. She wore their fates like armor. Her refusal to wed was not the whim of vanity, but the calculation of survival. Her court became a stage of mirrors, gallant men competing for favor, poets weaving verses of devotion, portraits sent and declined. Yet behind the glitter was a deliberate image, the Virgin Queen, pure yet untouchable, mother of her people rather than of flesh and blood. She cultivated that illusion with precision, understanding that distance was her shield. To be adored but not possessed was her form of sovereignty. Under her reign, England entered what later ages would call its Golden Age. Ships sailed to new worlds, theaters rose, poets and spies and explorers thrived beneath her gaze. Yet even as her legend grew, she remained haunted by the absence that defined her dynasty. The silence of a cradle never filled. Those who saw her in old age spoke of moments when the mask slipped. The proud queen, her face painted white, her red wig gleaming in torchlight, would touch her necklace, the one shaped like a bee, worn once by a mother she could not remember, and fall silent. In those pauses, the court felt the chill of history itself, the weight of generations buried beneath her crown. She had survived where all others had perished. But survival came at a cost. The Tudor bloodline, for which so many had died, would end with her. When she died in 1603, after 45 years on the throne, the candle that had burned since Bosworth Field finally guttered out. The last of Henry's children left no heir. The dynasty that had torn England from Rome, rewritten scripture, and stained its altars with both devotion and blood, dissolved into legend. The crown passed to the House of Stuart, and with it a new age began, one less burdened by the desperate cry for sons, but forever shaped by those who had tried and failed to bear them. In Westminster Abbey, Mary and Elizabeth lie buried together in the same tomb, two sisters divided in life, united in death. The inscription carved above them reads simply, "Partners both in throne and grave." It is an irony that history savors. The Catholic and the Protestant, the mother and the virgin, the failure and the triumph, resting side by side beneath the same stone. And so the story of Tudor childbirth ends where it began, in silence. The empire that had once measured salvation by fertility learned too late that legacy is not of blood alone. The women who suffered for sons gave England something far more enduring: faith, fire, and a crown forged from defiance. Their ghosts linger still, in the echo of cathedral bells, in the whisper of Latin prayers fading beneath English hymns, in the creak of old nursery floors, where no children ever played. They are the silent architects of a kingdom built upon their pain, queens whose wombs carried not heirs, but history itself. When the last candle burns low in the archives of time, and a historian brushes the dust from a parchment bearing their names, he will find there not failure, but endurance. For though the line of Tudor blood ended, the memory of its women, Catherine, Anne, Jane, Mary, Elizabeth, endures in every shadowed corridor of England's past, eternal as the sound of their unspoken lullabies.
Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more.